With more analysis, let's bring in Peter Dean, the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre. Peter, appreciate your time. Thank you. We just went through the timeline there. A lot of Australians will also be balking at the price tag, some $348 billion. Is this a worthwhile investment?
Well, yes, I think it is a worthwhile investment. I mean, the government, the country, and all three countries wouldn't be investing in this type of program if we weren't living in a very different strategic era than we were in the past. If we were living in a benign strategic environment in our region around the globe, we wouldn't have to invest in this. But I think when you look at the fact of what's been happening in our region, the massive military modernisation and expansion that the Chinese have undertaken, the largest since the Second World War, and of course the issues in Ukraine, we're living in a much more dangerous time, a much more significant time of strategic competition. And of course, as an island continent, as a country dependent upon maritime trade and maritime security, this is a really important investment. Submarines are the pinnacle of naval capability. And of course, the sharing of US technology is key because they are the most advanced submarines in the world. And this will ensure that Australia maintains a regional military capability edge in the underwater domain, which is one of the most important.
Yeah, just expand on that for us. What advantages will these nuclear-powered subs bring, and why the focus on the seas as opposed to the skies, for example?
Yes, well, we've always maintained a very credible submarine capability. And of course, our current Collins-class submarines are the best conventional submarines in the world, maintained and operated at a very high standard. But what we know with increased intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, the massive expansion of the Chinese submarine fleet, for instance, they've built 12 nuclear-powered submarines in the last 15 years. And by the time our first AUKUS boat is delivered in the early 2040s, they'll have in excess of 70 submarines in operation in our region. So that makes it critically important. And what we're seeing is with the Collins-class submarine, as every year goes on, they're getting more and more difficult to operate in terms of their safety and security. They're a diesel-electric submarine. They have a shorter range. They need to come to the surface quite often to run their diesel engines and to recharge their electric batteries. And of course, moving to a nuclear-powered submarine, you don't have to do that. They can stay on station significantly longer periods of time. And of course, they don't need to come close to the surface to snort or to recharge those batteries. So it's a quantum leap in technology. They're also a much more capable platform. They carry many more sensors, an unlimited supply of power through the nuclear reactor to operate autonomous vehicles, and also the ability to carry much greater weapons payload and capability. So these are the real predators of the sea. They can basically leave port from Western Australia and disappear under the ocean for months on end, and that provides an enormous deterrent effect for Australia and really means that we can maintain a cutting-edge capability in this. And for an island nation and continent dependent on trade, 99% of our trade comes and goes by sea. This is really critically important.
Is there a sovereignty issue here, Peter? We are clearly firmly relying on the US and in particular on US personnel in the initial stages.
Well, absolutely, but I think sovereignty issues have been a little bit overblown. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and others has made this very clear that this will be a sovereign capability for Australia, and the pathway we saw today is a pathway for Australia to take sovereign control over these submarines and of course building them here in Australia as well. But the transfer of technology and the sharing of training of personnel is no different to what we undertake in almost all of our military capabilities. If you look at our Air Force, for instance, we operate F-35 aircraft, Super Hornets, all of US origin. We operate combat systems in our current class of submarines and weapons that are of US origin. And including, there's very few countries in the world that can be completely supply chain, technology, design, capability, delivery and development sovereign in that sense. And even for the United States, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is actually, there's components and parts made by 8 different countries. So I don't think this changes the sovereignty question any more than it does with most of our other military capability. Of course, the pathway we will be on is very heavily reliant on the transfer of technology from the United States and the United Kingdom. But there is a clear pathway outlined today for Australia to take sovereign control, not only of the boats themselves, the crews and the operational elements of these submarines, but also the long-term build, maintenance and sustainment. And it really is a major advantage for us that we have allies like the United Kingdom and the United States to work with. This will be into the future easier for all 3 countries, therefore, to undertake co-investment to ensure that these capabilities stay at the cutting edge and more advanced than any other submarine force in the world. And that's what's really important here about the sharing between these three countries in this technology transfer pact.
So operationally here in Australia, do you foresee any problems in terms of how the Navy will cope with these changes? As I understand it, crews will need to be navigating 3 different designs of submarines over the next couple of decades. Do we have the crews with the ability to do that? Does that pose a real challenge in terms of upskilling our people?
Yes, it does. And look, what I would argue, this is a very high trusting relationship. You know, the United States is sharing some of their most sensitive ever military technology and capability with Australia. It's a very high risk in the way that the project's been laid out. Now, where we're doing is we're going for speed to capability here. So for most critics and pundits, no one would have guessed that we could have, by 2033, a nuclear submarine operating out of the Royal Australian Navy, as we're seeing with the Virginia class that's being put forward. But it's also very high risk. As you said, there is the potential here for us at one stage to be operating all 3 classes of submarines, the current Collins class, the interim Virginias and the new AUKUS boats. But if you look at the detail of this program, it's actually got some inherent flexibility in it and some inbuilt decision points that will be many, many years down the track. So the life of type extensions of our current Collins class submarines may not have to be done for all 6 boats. It might only have to be done for 4. We're buying 3 Virginia class, but an option of 2 more. So if the SSN AUKUS builds are delayed in any way, or we want to bring off the Collins class and retire them early, we have the option there of purchasing an additional 2 boats. So I think there is a clear pathway where we'll probably be operating Collins class and the Virginias, and then the Virginias and the AUKUS boats, so probably only 2. And of course, between the Virginia boat and the AUKUS boat will be a lot of commonality in weapon systems, in combat systems, and of course in reactors and technology. So I think the detail here is good, but what you've highlighted is probably the greatest risk of this project and the greatest risk for all 3 countries, and that is the workforce risk. At the moment, the Navy is really struggling to maintain enough submariners to operate the Collins-class submarines. And from an defence industrial point of view, this is going to require a massive uplift in all 3 countries. Now, what was announced today, the US will invest well over $4 or $5 billion into their submarine program for the maintenance and sustainment of their current fleet and to uplift some of their industrial capability. Rishi Sunak indicated there'll be a multi-billion-pound investment in their own shipyards. But some of those are still investments, inquiries that are underway. We don't know the absolute outcome of that. And of course, all 3 countries are struggling with people and personnel. And this is for Australia and for the United States and the United Kingdom, not just a submarine and defence industry problem, but a workforce problem in our economy more generally. Now, we can't solve this problem for submarines by simply opening up the borders and bringing in more skilled migrants. There are very high security requirements for people working in this area. But what we might be able to do is open up to the economy more migrants to fill other jobs, to transfer Australians into these very high-tech, very high-skilled required jobs. But I'd have to say the number one risk to this program, both in the short, medium and the long term, will be, do we have enough workforce, both in the Navy in uniform, but also in defence industry to realise this capability plan?
Peter Dean, always appreciate your insights as always. Thank you so much for joining us live there in Canberra.
Pleasure to be here.